In West Africa, they say, I stand by the protocols already established. And I believe it is very convenient because you don't end up annoying people because you got the order wrong. So let me start by saying how glad I am to be present with you this afternoon. This is an assembly of some of the best minds in Africa, with a sprinkling of other good minds from outside of the continent. And when I was invited to come and share my thoughts with you, I agonized and asked myself what it is that a lawyer can tell to an assembly of engineers. But I was cajoled, and ultimately I succumbed, and here I am to share my thoughts, whatever those thoughts are. When you fly across Africa today, if you fly into Entebbe, the airport is being expanded. I would want to hear that Ugandan consulting engineers are taking 80% of the credit. I would want to know, you will tell me. When I fly into Julius Kambarage International Airport in Dar es Salaam, I see the expansion that is going on there. I would want to know that the Tanzanian consulting engineer is playing the lion's role there. I would want to hear. When I go to Bole International Airport in Ethiopia, the expansion is going on there. I would want to know that the African engineer is involved there, that the African architect is involved there. When I go to Blaise Diagne Airport in Dakar, in Senegal, I would want not to hear that some French designer designed it. The tragedy is, what I would want to hear is not what I hear. So that the consulting African engineer is in quite a number of countries still consigned to doing some rural roads. So that we may commission our football stadia, but they are designed in China and built by Chinese. That is not the path of growth that I would want to hear. I would want to hear another path of growth. Let us learn from the Chinese, but let us learn to do certain things ourselves. This is what Africa must hear. This, in my view, is what Africa must do. This is what other civilizations have done for sustainable development. You ask the Koreans how they did it. Ask the Chinese how they did it. Ask any other civilizations how they did it. Ask the Indonesians how they are doing it. They are using expertise from the world, but certain things are ring-fenced for their own professional. Do we ring-fence things for ourselves? I'm told we are ring-fencing only 30% in Uganda. Why are we ring-fencing 30%? Let us ring-fence 70%. It can't be done because it is a question of cross-fertilization of ideas. We must learn from other civilizations, but learning must not mean surrendering to them. I'm submitting to us that we surrender to them. And going forward, therefore, you who are present here, we must think of another Africa. An Africa where when we talk about technology, whether it is in solar technology today, Morocco, and I stand to be corrected, is engaged in developing one of the largest solar farms anywhere in the world. I'm still talking about consulting engineers even in that field. Kenya is doing another major solar project, and all African countries ought to be engaged in it. Namibia, I think, is also engaged in it. But if you ask, who the consulting engineers are for those projects, they are not Africans. Even the solar panels that are going to be used, the best that African countries will do is to assemble them. They'll be brought as completely knocked down kits, and ours is to assemble them as our children assemble Lego. We are talking about water and water, which is an important thing, and water engineering. And we have consulting engineers in that regard. Even when we talk about water engineering and the drilling equipment, I know of no African country that makes water drilling equipment. Perhaps South Africa. South Africans correct me. When we are talking about road infrastructure, I know that sometimes even when we are doing the roads, even the one here, the Kampala and Entebbe Expressway, the contractors, under the guise of something that they now call design and build, will even import steel from their countries, saying that ours has too much carbon content. Sometimes even cement is imported because ours is claimed not to have certain ingredients. I'm still talking about consulting engineers. When we are doing our railways, we may celebrate them all we want, but when we receive the wagons, they are rehabilitated engines that belong to the museums alongside the spinning wheel. I'm submitting to us that the consulting engineer is important to Africa's growth and development. You cannot deny that. And I can see the vision. I can see what the African leaders were thinking about when they met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and came up with Agenda 2063. They were looking at the engineer and they were saying that the engineer, well, if he is a civil engineer, let him be an African civil engineer who is aware of the African terrain. Let him be an engineer who is equipped with what he or she needs to grow Africa, so that when he or she is engaged in designing and ultimately presiding over the building of African roads, he knows he is our continent. That is what they were thinking. So that when they are building this road across the continent to the equatorial forest of Congo, they are building and they are empowering other African engineers. I saw them thinking about that. They must have been thinking about hydroelectric power, and they were thinking about generating power from the nearly 1,270 hydroelectric power stations that we have built. They were thinking of geothermal, and they were thinking of consulting engineers who have African experience and know Africa and relate with other civilizations in a manner that is beneficial to Africa. They must have been thinking like that. When they were thinking about fuel, fossil fuel, and they were thinking about the pipeline, they must have been thinking about chemical engineers and other related engineers who would be doing things for the benefit of Africa. They were thinking about aeronautical engineers that would be capable not only of ensuring that the planes that are made in Europe and America fly, but who are moving progressively to ensuring that even Africa can produce an aircraft. The Brazilians have done it in our lifetime. But today, that is not the truth. So, fellow engineers, if I have dampened your spirit, that was my intention. Because it is those dampened spirits that are capable of providing a fertile ground for the fruit of growth to germinate. This continent is capable of achieving much. Africa today has a population of 1.1 billion. We are 55 countries, and all the 55 countries, our economy is only as big as that of India. We can do better. And if we are going to do better, I have no doubt in my mind that you great minds that are gathered here, because the minds that are present here are some of the best minds that Africa can offer. Let it not be business as usual. Let it not be that you have expanded your firm to include the 100 engineers to do work that has been handed down to you by some European or Chinese firm. No. Let it be that you are also capable of doing things in your own right. You can do it. You must do it. Because if you don't do it, the thing that we call growth will never be realized. We'll have symbols of what we describe as growth, but Africa will never grow. We'll have things that appear to represent growth, but Africa will never have grown. But yet there is a sense in which, even from a layman's perspective, one can speak about infrastructure and the role of the consulting engineer. As I travel across Africa, and I do that quite often, it is not lost on me that whether you are in Dakar, in Senegal, there are beautiful roads that are coming up. Whether you are in Bamako, in Mali, or Cotonou in Benin, or here in Uganda, or in Nairobi in Kenya, or in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, or whichever country, there is a sense in which, to the casual observer, dramatic changes are taking place in Africa. If it is not roads described as superhighways or expressways, it is an hydroelectric plant. If it is not a hydroelectric plant, it is a solar farm. If it is not a solar farm, it is some kind of construction that is going on. And to those who are in the business and in the habit of assessing development by those visually very intrusive projects, Africa is rising. But the question is Africa rising at the pace that she ought to rise? And if she is rising, for whom is she rising? And if she is rising, how is she rising? These are questions that sometimes at a forum such as this, in order to be a good guest, you do not want to go into too deep into them, lest you offend and annoy your audience at once. But yet there is wisdom in examining the role not only of the African consulting engineer, but the role of the African professional overall, particularly when we begin to assess ourselves as a continent which on average has been independent or having regained our independence, the 55 odd countries of Africa. Slightly over 62 years ago, if Ghana is the benchmark. There is the tendency, of course, when we talk about Africa, to talk about Africa as if she were homogeneous, with the consequence that we forget that despite our honest desire to create one homogeneous continent, we are diverse and we are divided into 55 odd countries. And that these countries are a reality. And there is a sense, therefore, in which we do not always, as a continent, speak with one voice. That the reality is that the French-speaking African countries find greater affinity with their former colonizer, assuming they left at all. And that when they are doing their infrastructural projects in Dakar, in Senegal, or in Bamako, in Mali, they are much more likely to incline to Paris. We don't want to say this, but I have to say it. That when you are colonized by the Portuguese, you are Mozambican or Angolan or Cape Verdean or Sao Tome and Principe, that you are much more likely to incline to Lisbon. And that we don't want to speak about it because we want to be politically correct, but I am saying it. That if you are colonized by the British, despite you are not wanting to say it, we are much more likely to incline to London, and it will be much more, if we are not careful, if Brexit succeeds, but we don't want to say it. And much more recently, there is greater affinity to China and Beijing because they have the money, but we don't want to say it because we want to be nice. We are saying all these because they have an implication on how the African engineer and indeed the African professional is going to react and to relate to the world. We are quick to talk about globalization, and it is a good thing. Globalization is something that we cannot run away from. But the question is Africa being gobbled in the name of globalization? So we are assembled here today to ask ourselves whether going forward, the consulting engineer is going to be a contributor to the development of Africa. And what is this thing that we describe as development or growth? What is it? Sometimes we do not want to assess it because we want to have that very thin veneer of what is clean and nice, but yet we do not want to scratch below it. Because there is a sense in which Africa, permit me to use this medical term, schizophrenic. So that you have the beauty and glitter of Kampala and Entebbe, of Kinshasa and Nairobi, of Dakar and Bamako, of Cotonou and Rabat, Morocco, of Egypt, but beyond that, where is Africa? Beyond the infrastructure, and it was not lost on me that in the opening remarks, the Vice President very ably and aptly told us how the connectivity exists between infrastructure and other things. But yet, somehow, despite the many infrastructural projects that we have had and continue to have in Africa, there is a sense in which Africa is still not realizing her potential. There is a sense in which Africa is still restless. You may have the beautiful streets. You may have electricity and potable water and solar energy and nanotechnology in Algiers, but there is a sense in which Africa is still restless. Why? As we talk about growth and development and the role of the consulting engineer. There is a sense in which the young African is still restless in Sudan. Why? There is a sense in which the young African is still restless in Cape Town and Johannesburg. Why? There is a sense in which the young African is still restless in Kampala, in Nairobi, and in Dar es Salaam. Why? Beyond infrastructure, what else must we do? There is a sense in which the African consulting engineer is also grumbling because in essence, the African consulting engineer, like the other African professionals, are still left to deal with crumbs. They are not at the dinner table where caviar is eaten. Why? in the name of globalization. When the big infrastructure projects are being undertaken in Africa, whether it's a railway line, I stand to be corrected. But the African consulting engineer plays a peripheral role. When a big road project is coming up anywhere in Africa, whether it's the east or the south, under the guise of what is called international tendering, I want to submit to us that the African consulting engineer is still playing a peripheral role. If it is a new hydroelectric project, we may commission them all we want, but the African engineer is still playing a peripheral role. Unless they enter into some kind of marriage of convenience with some international firm of consulting engineers, they don't get the work that they deserve. Why? These are uncomfortable questions. But I'm suggesting to us that until the day that the African consulting engineer begins to ask uncomfortable questions, our contribution to the growth of the continent will be only that minimal. You know, several years ago as a young man, I observed that we had major telecommunication companies, state-run, almost in every other African country. What we did when we regained independence, we said we are going to run our telephone companies. Several years down the line, most of our telephone companies are dead. And they have been replaced by multinational companies. We may indeed have mobile connectivity, but in Africa, ask yourself, who owns the mobile company? Who owns them? We had railway lines which were running in this part of the world. They were efficient. Several years down the line, having collapsed the railway lines, we now have what we are calling SGR. Who has built them? Who has financed them? And when will we pay for them? We don't want to ask such questions. They are uncomfortable. But we call them as representing growth, we say. When we cite growth, we talk about them. The question is Africa once again being shortchanged? Is it possible that those of us who have had the advantage of education as professionals are conniving and engaging in relationship with other professionals in a manner that is unequal in this continent? Do we ask ourselves whether the South Koreans with whom we can compare ourselves do things the same ways we do? Do we ask ourselves whether in South Korea, when they are doing their roads, 80% of what is done by South Koreans with a little assistance from others? Do we ask ourselves whether the earth-moving equipment that is being used in our roads are made in Africa? Do we ask ourselves what component of our raw material is used, or those are too uncomfortable to ask? We can even go to Vietnam, which all of us know was bombed to the ground as recently as 1975, and see the infrastructure that is coming out in Vietnam. Is the model that they are using the same model that we are using in Africa? When we are told that they are world standard, standards? Are they truly world standards? Or they are designed to exclude us? Because if they were world standards, why is it that the roads that are made in Kinshasa are not the same as the roads that are made in Columbus, Ohio? These are questions that we must begin to ask. They are uncomfortable. But going forward, when we talk about Africa regaining her position in the world amongst the Committee of Nations in terms of infrastructural growth, we must ask ourselves the foundational questions. Are we doing the right things right? Africa Agenda 2063 promises us, among other things, that by the year 2063, we will have, hopefully, roads that are running from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, through to Dakar in Senegal, from Cape Town to Cairo. We are promising ourselves that Kinshasa will be the Silicon Valley of Africa. We are promising ourselves that we will have electric trains running from Angola, Luanda to Swakini in Sudan. We are promising ourselves many good things, but the question is, are we prepared? The question is, are we using African expertise for the benefit of Africa? Are African professionals having the time to contribute in an effective manner? You, the engineers who are here, must ask yourself the foundational question: are you really participants in the struggle to grow Africa? Is it possibly the case that if an African firm has to have a chance in a competition for some major project, they cannot succeed until and unless they are in collaboration with a Chinese firm or an English firm or an American firm? Is that the reality? And if it is it a good thing? These are the uncomfortable questions that we must ask ourselves. Is it the case that in this day and age, if your qualification is to be considered to be a qualification worth its salt, it must be obtained in some country outside of Africa, and that if you have a qualification from within an African university, then you are second-guessed by other civilizations? Perhaps you who are present here do not suffer this fate. But what about your children and children's children? Will they have, because none of you, holding all factors constant, will be around in 2063. And even if you are, you'll be too old to be useful. The question is, as we talk about the role of the consulting engineer in Africa, we must ask ourselves the fundamental questions. And to me, the fundamentals is that Africa must progressively begin to work as a united bloc. I am aware that FIDIC does great work in the world. FIDIC was founded in 1913. No African country had regained her independence. Except Liberia, they were not there at the founding. When you participate in FIDIC, are you at the dinner table as diners, as I've said before, or as waiters? Because you can be at the dinner table as waiters, or as diners, or as food to be consumed. Where are you? So we must have our stake in FIDIC, in international organization, so that when we talk of standardizations, we are participating in real terms, not by mere presence. If we want to be heard as Africans, we must have a united front. The 55 of us. We must work under the aegis of the African Union, and our voice must be clear and unequivocal. Because if it is not clear and unequivocal, we will be divided, and that is a fact. You know, just last night, I was reading a speech that was delivered by Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah on the 12th day of January 1961 in Casablanca, Morocco. And he was saying, and I agree with him, that Africa has lost out in what Europe defines as the Industrial Revolution. But it is now our duty to ensure that we leapfrog it, because we have had the advantage of seeing what they did not do right. It gives us the opportunity of avoiding the landmines that they stepped on. And that Africa will only do so if Africa recognizes the artificiality of their boundaries, so that when we are licensing engineers in Accra, in Ghana, that engineer must have the competence to work in Casablanca, in Morocco, and in Tunis, in Tunisia. It is only then that we will be able to compete, and compete effectively for the benefit of Africa. And he went on to say that Africa therefore requires a new man and a new woman. A new man and a new woman who recognizes that in the world there is cutthroat competition and throats are actually being cut. And that therefore, as professionals, we must begin to initiate activities that are going to change the lives of our people. And I believe that that is one of the reasons when he went back to Ghana, he started thinking about the Akosombo Dam in Ghana. He then went to Liberia and said, why are we not having factories to make our rubber here? He was asking foundational questions. Fellow engineers or fellow professionals, I'm not an engineer. Africa is at crossroads. The question is, which one do we take? Do we take the path of professionalism that learned from other civilizations for the long-term sustainability of the continent, or do we take the path of following other civilizations and marveling at what they do to the detriment of the continent of Africa? So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to remind you and to remind myself that if Africa is to realize our potential in the world of infrastructure, because as the Vice President rightly said, if you have infrastructure, it has an impact on agriculture, it has an impact on mining, it has an impact on the health sector, it has an impact in every other sector in our economies. It can be done. It must be done. And you are the ones who are going to do it. And remember that the world is not very kind. All of us know. Every other person in every other part of the world is trying to ensure that they are at the top of the food chain. Where is Africa in the food chain? Are we at the bottom of the food chain, or we are at the top of the food chain? I am saying we are at the bottom, and going forward we must fight our way to ensure that we are beginning to talk about things like nanotechnology. What are we teaching in our universities? Most of our universities, faculties of engineering have equipment that were used in Europe during the industrial age. I'm saying this rather melodramatically, but I'm making my point. We must change. There must be a linkage between the practicing consulting engineer and the universities. There must be a linkage between that and industry. It cannot be right that in this day and age, that linkage is not there. And I believe that under the aegis of Gamma and FIDIC, it can be done, and that deliberate efforts are going to be made to ensure that we move in that positive direction, so that Agenda 2063 is realized and the promises under the Sustainable Development Goals are also realized. I want to conclude this with this. Have you realized that several years ago we had something called the Millennium Development Goals? They were never achieved. So we have renamed them Sustainable Development Goals, and there are more now. So the truth is, Africa must also define her own problems, and having defined her own problems, must also find solutions to her own problem. Do not be cheated. Do not be deluded that the world is full of benevolent individuals and institutions whose only claim to fame is that they want to lift Africa from the morass that she now finds herself in. The reality is, the poverty of Africa is the glory of some civilizations. Poverty is an industry. Ignorance is an industry, big industry. And there are those who want Africa to continue to wallow in poverty and to wallow in ignorance because it is their safest bet to their continued benefit. The day we wake up to that reality, the safer we are. That is why the English had this beautiful saying, let sleeping dogs lie. So we are sleeping, and we are being allowed to lie. And we are being hypnotized into even greater sleep and slumber, to dream even further. But I'm telling us, if Africa is to realize our dream, we must wake up. If Africa is to win the lottery, we must buy the lottery ticket. God bless.
A round of applause for Professor PLO Lumumba, ladies and gentlemen. He spoke for all that time without any notes.